Sometimes the most life-changing moments come disguised as our biggest mistakes. Sarah Martinez thought she was just defending herself against what seemed like harassment during her first week of Navy basic training. She had no idea that the person she was about to swing at would become her greatest mentor, her toughest critic, and, ultimately, the reason she would rise to heights she never imagined possible. What happens when an 18-year-old recruit from a small Texas town throws a punch at someone who turns out to be one of the most decorated Navy SEALs in modern military history? What happens when that moment of defiance becomes the foundation of an extraordinary journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about strength, courage, and what it truly means to serve? This is the true story of how one impulsive moment led to a transformation that would echo through the halls of Naval Special Warfare Command for years to come. It's a story about second chances, hidden potential, and the unlikely friendship between a rookie who thought she had nothing to lose and a legend who saw something in her that she couldn't see in herself. The punch lasted less than a second. The journey it started would last a lifetime. Sarah Martinez stepped off the bus at Naval Station Great Lakes with her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the shouting of the drill instructors. The Illinois air was crisp and unforgiving, a stark contrast to the warm Texas breeze she had left behind just 2 days earlier. At 18 years old, she carried everything she owned in a single duffel bag and everything she feared in the tight knot forming in her stomach. The girl who had dominated her high school wrestling team and worked construction jobs alongside grown men suddenly felt very small. The concrete buildings stretched endlessly before her, gray and imposing against an equally gray sky. This wasn't the adventure she had imagined when she signed her enlistment papers 6 months ago. This felt like stepping into a machine designed to break people down and rebuild them into something entirely different. Sarah came from Sweetwater, Texas, population 10,906 on a good day. Her father, Miguel, had worked the oil rigs until his back gave out when she was 14. Her mother, Rosa, cleaned houses and worked nights at the local diner to keep food on the table. They had immigrated from Mexico before Sarah was born, chasing the American dream with the kind of desperate hope that only people who have lost everything once before can truly understand. When Miguel's injury left them struggling to make ends meet, Sarah watched her parents work themselves to exhaustion trying to maintain their dignity and their small piece of the American promise. She had been the first Martinez to graduate high school. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, had pushed her to consider college, but Sarah knew the mathematics of her family's situation better than anyone. College meant debt they couldn't afford and time they didn't have. The Navy offered something different, a steady paycheck, healthcare, and, most importantly, the chance to send money home while learning skills that could support her family for years to come. But, standing in that reception area, surrounded by young people who seemed to know exactly what they were doing, Sarah began to question every choice that had brought her to this moment. The recruit next to her was discussing his family's military tradition going back to World War II. Another was casually mentioning her father's rank as a Marine colonel. Sarah kept quiet about her own background, suddenly, aware of how different her story was from everyone else's. The first few days blurred together in a haze of medical examinations, paperwork, and constant movement from one station to another. Sarah quickly learned that personal space was a luxury that no longer existed. She shared living quarters with 7 other women from backgrounds as diverse as America itself. There was Jennifer from Connecticut, whose boarding school education was evident in every precisely articulated word. Ashley from Alabama brought an easy Southern charm that made instant friends. Maria from Los Angeles had street smarts that Sarah recognized and respected immediately. But it was during their first real training exercise that Sarah began to understand she might be in over her head. The obstacle course seemed designed by someone who had never met a human being. Ropes that burned her hands raw, walls that seemed impossibly high, and muddy crawls that left everyone looking like they had been buried alive. While some of her fellow recruits struggled with the physical demands, Sarah found herself keeping pace with the strongest performers. Her years of wrestling and construction work had built a foundation of functional strength that served her well. The problem wasn't her body. The problem was her mouth. Sarah had grown up in a household where speaking your mind was not just accepted but expected. Her parents had taught her to stand up for herself and others, to never back down from what she believed was right. These were admirable qualities in civilian life. In military training, they were proving to be significant liabilities. When recruit Stevens from Ohio made a comment about certain people not belonging in real military roles, Sarah didn't hesitate to set him straight. When their petty officers seemed to take particular pleasure in making the few minority recruits repeat exercises that others were allowed to pass, Sarah spoke up. Each time, she faced additional physical training, extra duties, or both. Her fellow recruits began to see her as either a troublemaker or someone with more courage than common sense. The truth was somewhere in between. Sarah wasn't trying to be rebellious. She was trying to survive in an environment that felt hostile in ways she hadn't expected. The military had been integrated for decades, and she had assumed that meant acceptance. What she discovered was that policy and practice weren't always the same thing, and that her brown skin and accented last name made her a target for people who viewed her presence as some kind of political statement rather than personal choice. By the end of her second week, Sarah had developed a reputation as someone who wouldn't back down. This brought both positive and negative attention. Some recruits admired her willingness to stand up to unfairness. Others saw her as someone who made waves unnecessarily. The drill instructors seemed divided between respect for her physical capabilities and frustration with her inability to keep quiet when she disagreed with something. It was during a particularly difficult training evolution that Sarah first heard whispers about someone called the commander. Apparently, there was an officer who occasionally observed training exercises, someone whose presence could make even the toughest drill instructors nervous. Nobody seemed to know exactly what this person's role was, but the stories suggested someone with significant influence and a reputation for identifying potential in unlikely places. Sarah didn't pay much attention to these rumors. She was too focused on surviving each day and proving that she belonged. Every morning brought new challenges, new opportunities to fail, and new chances to demonstrate that a kid from Sweetwater, Texas could handle whatever the Navy threw at her. She attacked every obstacle with the same determination that had helped her pin opponents twice her size on the wrestling mat. But determination alone wasn't enough to navigate the complex social dynamics of military life. Sarah found herself caught between competing loyalties and expectations. Her fellow recruits looked to her for leadership when facing unfair treatment, but that same leadership put her at odds with an institutional structure that valued compliance above individual justice. She was learning that courage and wisdom weren't the same thing, and that standing up for what was right sometimes required strategic thinking rather than immediate action. The weekend before the incident that would change everything, Sarah called home for the first time since arriving. Her parents asked about her training, her fellow recruits, and whether she was happy with her decision to enlist. Sarah found herself editing her experiences, focusing on the positive aspects while downplaying the challenges she faced daily. She told them about the physical training she was mastering and the skills she was learning. She didn't mention the nights she lay awake wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Rosa Martinez had an uncanny ability to read her daughter's mood even across 1,000 miles of telephone line. "Mija," she said quietly, "remember that strength is not just about how hard you can hit. Sometimes strength is about knowing when not to hit at all." Sarah would remember those words 3 days later, when she found herself face to face with a situation that would test every lesson she had learned about strength, courage, and the difference between fighting and defending. She would remember them as she made a split-second decision that could have ended her military career before it truly began. And she would remember them as she discovered that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against enemies, but against our own assumptions about who our enemies actually are. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal hidden truths about military culture, personal growth, and the unexpected ways that mentorship can emerge from moments of apparent conflict. Sarah Martinez, the girl from Sweetwater who had never backed down from a fight, was about to learn that the most significant victories sometimes come disguised as defeats, and that the people who challenge us most forcefully are often the ones who believe in us most deeply. The morning of the incident started like any other Tuesday at Great Lakes. Reveille at 0530 hours, followed by the familiar routine of making racks with hospital corners so tight they could bounce quarters, and the mad scramble to get dressed and ready for morning formation. Sarah had developed a rhythm after 3 weeks of training, moving through her morning preparations with the efficiency that military life demanded. She had no way of knowing that this particular Tuesday would become a defining moment not just in her naval career, but in her understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. The day's schedule included combat training, which always put an extra edge of tension in the air. Hand-to-hand combat instruction was where personalities clashed most violently, where the stress of basic training combined with physical aggression in ways that sometimes revealed the worst in people. Sarah had excelled in these sessions, her wrestling background giving her advantages that surprised both her instructors and fellow recruits. But success in combat training also made her a target for those who felt threatened by her competence. During morning chow, Sarah noticed an unusual amount of activity among the drill instructors. They huddled in conversations that stopped abruptly when recruits came too close, and there was an underlying current of nervous energy that seemed to affect everyone. Jennifer, her bunkmate from Connecticut, whispered that she had overheard something about a special evaluation happening today, but nobody knew what that meant or who was being evaluated. The combat training took place in a large gymnasium that had been modified with wrestling mats and various training equipment. The walls were lined with motivational posters and photos of Medal of Honor recipients, their faces staring down at the recruits with expressions that seemed to say, "Prove you're worthy of wearing the same uniform." The instructor for the day was Petty Officer First Class Williams, a compact woman with 20 years of experience and a reputation for pushing recruits to their absolute limits. Williams divided the recruits into groups for sparring exercises, emphasizing technique over raw power. Sarah found herself paired with Stevens, the same recruit whose earlier comments had earned him a reputation as someone who enjoyed testing boundaries in the worst possible ways. He had been increasingly aggressive in his interactions with the female recruits, particularly those he perceived as vulnerable or different. His behavior had been reported multiple times, but military bureaucracy moved slowly, and Stevens seemed to interpret the lack of immediate consequences as permission to escalate. The sparring session began routinely enough. Williams demonstrated a series of defensive moves designed to neutralize an attacker while maintaining control. The techniques required trust between partners, with one person playing the aggressor while the other practiced the defensive response. Sarah and Stevens were instructed to alternate roles, with Williams observing and correcting their form. When Stevens was playing the aggressor, his attacks came with more force than necessary for training purposes. Sarah absorbed the impacts without complaint, focusing on executing the defensive techniques properly. But, when their roles reversed, Stevens made his resentment clear. Instead of allowing Sarah to practice the moves on him, he resisted aggressively, making comments under his breath about girls who think they're tough and diversity hires who don't belong here. Petty Officer Williams was working with another pair when Stevens decided to escalate beyond the prescribed training scenario. Instead of playing his assigned role as the person being defended against, he grabbed Sarah in a way that was both inappropriate and completely outside the bounds of the exercise. His grip was designed to hurt rather than simulate combat, and his whispered comments made it clear that this was personal rather than professional. Sarah's initial response was to use the techniques they had just learned to break free from his grip. But Stevens, rather than accepting the training outcome, retaliated with a move that had nothing to do with the curriculum and everything to do with his desire to humiliate her. He used his size advantage to slam her to the mat with unnecessary force, then made a comment about her body that crossed every line of professional conduct. That was when Sarah's training, her upbringing, and her survival instincts all converged into a single moment of decision. She had spent 3 weeks learning to follow orders, to accept criticism, to subordinate her individual impulses to military discipline. But she had also spent 18 years learning that some lines should never be crossed, and that sometimes standing up for yourself requires action rather than words. Sarah came up from the mat with a punch that carried the power of every injustice she had experienced since arriving at Great Lakes. It was a perfect right cross, delivered with the technique of someone who had spent years learning to fight and the anger of someone who was tired of being treated as less than human. The punch caught Stevens perfectly on the jaw, sending him backward into the gymnasium equipment with a crash that brought the entire room to a standstill. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah became aware of several things simultaneously. Stevens was sprawled on the floor, clearly dazed but not seriously injured. Every recruit in the gymnasium was staring at her with expressions ranging from admiration to horror. Petty Officer Williams was running toward them with a look that suggested Sarah's military career might be over before it really began. And, standing in the doorway of the gymnasium, unnoticed until this moment, was a figure that Sarah would later learn had been observing the training session for reasons that had nothing to do with routine evaluation. The person was wearing utilities without rank insignia visible, of average height and build, with the kind of relaxed posture that suggested complete comfort in any environment. Most striking were the eyes, which seemed to take in every detail of the situation without revealing any judgment about what they were seeing. As Stevens struggled to his feet and Williams began barking orders for everyone to return to their assigned positions, Sarah found herself making eye contact with the observer in the doorway. For just a moment, she thought she saw something that might have been approval, or perhaps recognition. Then, the moment passed, and the figure was gone, leaving Sarah to face the immediate consequences of her actions. Williams ordered Sarah to report to the company office immediately, while Stevens was sent to medical for evaluation. The other recruits continued their training in an atmosphere that was both subdued and electric with tension. Sarah walked across the base with her mind racing, trying to process what had just happened and what it might mean for her future. The company office was a sterile space filled with military efficiency and the kind of furniture that was designed for function rather than comfort. Sarah stood at attention while waiting to face whatever disciplinary action awaited her. She had no regrets about defending herself, but she also understood that military justice might not see the situation the same way. Stevens came from a family with military connections, while Sarah was just a kid from Texas with no influence and no protection beyond her own performance record. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Sarah was called into the commander's office. She expected to find her company commander waiting to deliver consequences that could range from extra duty to discharge from the Navy. Instead, she found herself face to face with the same person who had been observing from the gymnasium doorway, now seated behind the commander's desk with a file open that she somehow knew contained information about her. The nameplate on the desk read Commander Taylor, but there were no other identifying details visible. No ribbons, no warfare insignia, no indication of specialty or background. Just a person in uniform who radiated the kind of quiet authority that Sarah had learned to recognize in people who had nothing left to prove to anyone. Commander Taylor studied Sarah for a long moment before speaking. When the words came, they were not what Sarah had expected to hear. Instead of condemnation or threats of disciplinary action, Taylor asked a simple question that would begin a conversation Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. "Recruit Martinez," Commander Taylor said, "tell me exactly what you think just happened in that gymnasium." Sarah found herself faced with a choice that would determine not just her immediate fate, but the entire trajectory of her military career. She could give the answer that might protect her from punishment, emphasizing Stevens' inappropriate behavior and her right to defend herself. She could try to minimize the incident, suggesting it was just training that got out of hand. Or she could tell the complete truth about what had happened and why she had made the choice to fight back, regardless of the consequences. Looking into Commander Taylor's eyes, Sarah made a decision that would prove to be the most important of her young life. She chose honesty, even though honesty might cost her everything she had worked for. She began to speak, not knowing that the person listening was someone who had spent years looking for exactly the kind of person Sarah Martinez was about to prove herself to be. Sarah took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything. Standing at attention in front of Commander Taylor's desk, she chose to tell the absolute truth, regardless of the consequences. Her voice was steady as she recounted the events in the gymnasium, from Stevens' inappropriate behavior to her decision to defend herself with force. She didn't make excuses or try to minimize her actions. She simply told the story exactly as it had happened, including her own anger and her recognition that striking another recruit was a serious violation of military discipline. Commander Taylor listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but never changing expression. When Sarah finished her account, the office fell into a silence that seemed to stretch forever. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat and the distant sounds of training continuing elsewhere on the base. She waited for judgment, punishment, or dismissal, prepared to accept whatever consequences came from her honesty. Instead, Commander Taylor asked another unexpected question. "Recruit Martinez, what do you know about the Naval Special Warfare community?" Sarah blinked in confusion. The question seemed completely unrelated to the situation at hand. "Sir, I know that special warfare includes the Navy SEALs and other specialized units. I know they handle missions that require exceptional physical and mental capabilities. What else? I know they're highly selective, sir. Only a small percentage of candidates complete the training successfully. Commander Taylor nodded and opened a different file on the desk. What you might not know is that the special warfare community is constantly looking for people with specific characteristics. Physical capability is important, but it's not the most important factor. Mental toughness, the ability to make quick decisions under pressure, unwavering moral courage, and the willingness to protect others even at personal cost, these are the qualities that separate successful operators from everyone else. Sarah wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but she sensed it was important to pay attention to every word. Commander Taylor continued, "We've been watching your performance since you arrived at Great Lakes. Your physical capabilities were noted immediately, but we've been more interested in your responses to stress, your willingness to stand up for other recruits, and your reaction to unfair treatment." The puzzle pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind, but the picture they formed seemed too incredible to believe. Commander Taylor stood and walked to a wall display that Sarah hadn't noticed before. It contained photographs and certificates, but not the typical military awards she expected to see. These were different images of small teams in environments that looked hostile and unforgiving, certificates from training programs Sarah had never heard of, and one particular photograph that made her stomach drop. The photograph showed a group of people in combat gear, faces painted for camouflage, standing beside what was clearly a completed mission objective. At the center of the group, easily recognizable despite the face paint and tactical equipment, was Commander Taylor. The caption below identified the mission as a classified operation that had taken place 2 years earlier, and Commander Taylor was identified by a call sign that Sarah recognized from news reports about special operations successes. "You're Commander Alex Taylor," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're the Navy SEAL who led the hostage rescue in Somalia. And the operation in Afghanistan that saved those Marines." Commander Taylor returned to the desk and sat down. "Among other things, yes. But, more importantly for our current conversation, I'm someone who has spent the last 8 years identifying and recruiting people who have the potential to serve in naval special warfare. That's why I was observing your training today." Sarah's mind was reeling. The person she had just confessed to punching another recruit was one of the most famous Navy SEALs of the current generation, someone whose exploits had been featured in news reports and military publications. Commander Taylor was a living legend, someone who had accomplished things that most people could barely imagine. "The incident in the gymnasium was unfortunate," Commander Taylor continued, "but it was also illuminating. You were faced with a situation where following standard procedure would have meant accepting inappropriate treatment. Instead, you made a split-second decision to defend yourself, using exactly the amount of force necessary to stop the threat without causing permanent harm. That kind of judgment under pressure is exactly what we look for." Sarah struggled to process what she was hearing. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand. Are you saying that punching Stevens was the right thing to do?" "I'm saying that your response demonstrated several qualities that are essential for special operations personnel. You assessed a threat, determined that official channels weren't going to provide immediate protection, and took decisive action to protect yourself while minimizing collateral damage. Those are advanced tactical concepts that we spend months teaching to SEAL candidates." Commander Taylor pulled out another file and opened it on the desk. Sarah could see it contained her complete military record, including assessments she hadn't known were being conducted. "Your physical scores place you in the top 5% of recruits. Your psychological evaluations indicate exceptional mental resilience and moral courage. Your instructors have noted your natural leadership abilities and your willingness to help struggling teammates. Most importantly, you've demonstrated that you can make hard decisions when it matters." The conversation that followed would prove to be the most important of Sarah's life. Commander Taylor explained that the Naval Special Warfare community had been quietly observing her since her second week of basic training. Her combination of physical capabilities, mental toughness, and moral courage had flagged her as a potential candidate for programs that most people didn't even know existed. However, Commander Taylor continued, there are significant challenges ahead. The special warfare community has traditionally been male-dominated, and, while policies have changed to allow women in combat roles, the cultural adaptation has been slower. You would be entering an environment where you would need to prove yourself repeatedly, where some people would view your presence as a political statement rather than a professional opportunity. Sarah thought about her experiences so far in basic training, about the challenges she had already faced simply for being different. "Sir, I've been dealing with people who don't think I belong somewhere my entire life." That's not new. This would be different. The standards in special operations are absolute. There are no accommodations, no adjusted expectations, no allowances for anything except performance. You would be expected to meet exactly the same standards as everyone else, and you would be evaluated by people who might be looking for reasons to prove you don't belong. Commander Taylor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the training areas where Sarah had spent the last 3 weeks learning to be a sailor. The question is whether you're interested in finding out what you're truly capable of. Whether you want to continue on your current path, which will lead to a perfectly honorable career in the Navy, or whether you want to try for something that most people would consider impossible. Sarah didn't hesitate. What would I need to do? The smile that crossed Commander Taylor's face was slight but unmistakable. First, you would need to complete basic training successfully, which means no more punching other recruits, regardless of how much they might deserve it. Then, you would need to pass a preliminary screening process that will test every aspect of your capabilities. If you make it through screening, you would be invited to attempt basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, commonly known as BUD/S. Commander Taylor returned to the desk and sat down. "I need to be completely honest with you about what you're considering. BUD/S has roughly an 80% failure rate. The training is designed to push people beyond what they think they can endure, physically and mentally. Many people who attempt it are already in exceptional physical condition and still don't make it through. The psychological pressure is intense, and the margin for error is essentially zero." Sarah listened to this information with growing excitement rather than concern. Every challenge Commander Taylor described sounded like an opportunity to prove what she was capable of achieving. "When would I start the screening process?" "If you're serious about this path, we would begin additional preparation immediately. Your regular training would continue, but you would also participate in specialized conditioning designed to prepare you for what comes next. This isn't something you can approach casually. It requires complete commitment and the willingness to sacrifice everything else for the chance to succeed." The conversation continued for another hour as Commander Taylor outlined exactly what Sarah would be getting into if she chose to pursue special operations training. The physical demands alone were staggering: swimming distances that seemed impossible, running times that would challenge Olympic athletes, and strength requirements that pushed human capabilities to their limits. The mental challenges were equally demanding, with sleep deprivation, stress inoculation, and leadership scenarios designed to reveal character under the worst possible circumstances. But, as Commander Taylor described each challenge, Sarah felt a growing certainty that this was exactly what she was meant to do. Everything in her life had been preparing her for this opportunity: the years of wrestling that had taught her to push through physical discomfort, the construction work that had built functional strength and endurance, the family struggles that had developed mental resilience, and even the challenges she had faced in basic training that had revealed her natural leadership instincts. When Commander Taylor finished the explanation, Sarah was asked to make a choice that would determine the rest of her military career. She could continue with her current training track and become a skilled sailor in whatever field she chose. Or she could accept the challenge of trying to become one of the most elite warriors in the world, knowing that the odds were heavily against success but that the rewards for those who made it through were beyond imagination. Sarah Martinez, the girl from Sweetwater, Texas, who had thrown a punch at what she thought was just another recruit causing problems, looked across the desk at one of the most accomplished Navy SEALs in modern history and made her decision. Sarah's answer was immediate and unwavering. "I want to try, sir. I want the chance to see what I'm capable of." Commander Taylor nodded as if this response had been expected. "Then, we begin immediately. But first, you need to understand that everything about your training changes from this moment forward. You'll continue with regular basic training requirements, but you'll also begin supplemental conditioning that will prepare you for what comes next. This additional training will take place during what would normally be your personal time, and it will be significantly more demanding than anything you've experienced so far. The next day, Sarah's life transformed in ways she hadn't anticipated. She woke up an hour earlier than everyone else for additional physical training with Commander Taylor. These sessions took place in a specialized facility that she hadn't known existed on the base, equipped with pools for extended swimming, obstacle courses that made the standard training equipment look simple, and weights that challenged her in completely new ways. Commander Taylor's approach to training was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Every exercise had a purpose beyond simple physical conditioning. Swimming sessions weren't just about building endurance, they were about maintaining performance while dealing with cold water, limited visibility, and the kind of stress that could induce panic in unprepared individuals. Running wasn't just about speed and distance, it was about navigation under pressure, making decisions while exhausted, and maintaining situational awareness even when her body was screaming for rest. But the most challenging aspect of her new training routine wasn't physical at all. Commander Taylor spent significant time working on what she called mental conditioning exercises designed to test Sarah's ability to think clearly and make good decisions when everything around her was chaotic. These scenarios ranged from complex problem-solving exercises conducted while physically exhausted to leadership challenges where Sarah had to convince others to follow her lead despite having no formal authority. One particularly memorable exercise involved a simulated hostage situation where Sarah had to develop and execute a rescue plan using limited resources and imperfect information. The scenario was conducted in a mock building constructed specifically for training purposes, complete with multiple rooms, varying light conditions, and role players who made the situation as realistic as possible without actual danger. Sarah's first attempt was a complete failure. She made decisions too quickly, failed to gather enough information, and ended up rescuing the wrong person while the actual hostages remained in danger. Commander Taylor's feedback was direct and uncompromising. In real operations, people die when you make mistakes like that. Let's talk about what went wrong and how to fix it. Over the next 2 hours, they dissected every decision Sarah had made, examining alternative approaches and discussing the kind of thinking that separated successful operators from those who didn't make it through training. Commander Taylor emphasized that physical capabilities were only the foundation. The real challenge was developing the mental discipline to perform complex tasks while under extreme stress. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to excel in her regular basic training. Her fellow recruits began to notice changes in her performance that went beyond simple physical improvement. She seemed calmer under pressure, more focused during challenging exercises, and increasingly confident in her ability to handle whatever was thrown at her. Some recruits wondered what had happened after the incident with Stevens, but Sarah had been instructed to keep her additional training confidential, so she simply said the matter had been resolved satisfactorily. Stevens himself had become considerably less aggressive after their confrontation. Whether this was due to official counseling, unofficial warnings, or simply the realization that Sarah wasn't someone to be trifled with remained unclear. But the improvement in training atmosphere was noticeable to everyone, and several female recruits privately thanked Sarah for standing up to behavior that had made their own experience unnecessarily difficult. 3 weeks into her specialized training, Commander Taylor introduced Sarah to other members of the Special Operations community who would be involved in her evaluation process. These individuals came from various backgrounds within naval special warfare, each bringing different perspectives and expertise to her preparation. There was Senior Chief Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname, a veteran of multiple deployments who specialized in combat diving and underwater operations. Master Chief Johnson brought expertise in advanced weapons systems and small unit tactics. Lieutenant Commander Singh was a relatively recent graduate of SEAL training herself, providing insight into the current state of the program and the specific challenges that female candidates might face. Working with this team, Sarah began to understand the scope of what she was attempting. These weren't just elite athletes or skilled warriors, they were individuals who had mastered complex technical skills while maintaining peak physical condition and developing the kind of mental resilience that allowed them to function effectively in environments where most people would shut down completely. The gap between her current capabilities and what would be required seemed enormous, but each day of training brought measurable improvement. The swimming portion of her training proved to be particularly challenging. While Sarah was a competent swimmer, the standards for naval special warfare were far beyond anything she had previously attempted. She needed to be able to swim long distances while carrying equipment, navigate underwater in zero-visibility conditions, and maintain performance even when dealing with hypothermia or other physical stressors. Senior Chief Martinez pushed her through sessions that left her gasping and exhausted, always emphasizing that in real operations, the margin for error was essentially zero. The water doesn't care about your personal feelings or your family situation or whether you think the standards are fair, Martinez explained during one particularly difficult session. The water will kill you if you're not prepared, and being almost ready isn't good enough when lives are on the line. But perhaps the most valuable aspect of her training was the leadership development that Commander Taylor incorporated into every exercise. Sarah found herself constantly placed in situations where she had to make decisions that affected others, or her choices would determine success or failure for an entire team. These scenarios revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed and weaknesses that needed immediate attention. During one exercise, Sarah was given command of a team tasked with retrieving simulated intelligence from a defended position. The team included other trainees from various special operations programs, each with their own strengths and specialties. Sarah's initial instinct was to develop a plan based on her own capabilities and, then, assign roles to others based on what she thought they could handle. This approach failed spectacularly, resulting in the team being captured before they could complete their objective. Commander Taylor's debrief was characteristically direct. You treated your team members like tools to be used rather than skilled professionals to be consulted. Good leaders don't just give orders, they gather information, consider alternatives, and make decisions based on the input and capabilities of their entire team. The exercise was repeated with Sarah taking a completely different approach. This time, she spent significant time learning about each team member's background and capabilities before developing a plan that utilized everyone's strengths while compensating for weaknesses. The mission was successful, but, more importantly, Sarah learned a fundamental lesson about leadership that would serve her throughout her career. As her basic training neared completion, Sarah's performance in both regular and specialized exercises had improved to levels that surprised even Commander Taylor. Her physical scores were now in the top 1% of all recruits, but, more importantly, her decision-making abilities and leadership skills had developed to the point where she was consistently successful in complex scenarios that challenged much more experienced trainees. The night before her basic training graduation, Commander Taylor called Sarah in for a final conversation about her future. The specialized training had been successful beyond expectations, but the real test was still ahead. If Sarah chose to continue, she would be sent to a preliminary screening program that would determine whether she was ready to attempt BUD/S training. This screening was itself extremely challenging, with a failure rate that eliminated most candidates before they ever reached the main program. "You've exceeded every expectation we had when this process began," Commander Taylor told her. "Your physical capabilities are exceptional, your mental resilience is remarkable, and your leadership potential is obvious to everyone who has worked with you. But I need you to understand that what comes next makes everything you've done so far look like preparation exercises." Commander Taylor showed Sarah statistics about SEAL training that painted a sobering picture of what lay ahead. Of the candidates who were accepted for BUD/S training, roughly 80% didn't complete the program. Of those who did complete initial training, additional selection processes eliminated even more. The final result was that less than 5% of people who attempted to become Navy SEALs actually succeeded. "The question isn't whether you're capable of succeeding," Commander Taylor continued. "The question is whether you're prepared to commit everything you have to the attempt. This isn't something you can approach half-heartedly or treat as an experiment. It requires absolute dedication and the willingness to sacrifice everything else for the chance to achieve something that most people would consider impossible." Sarah had been preparing for this moment throughout her specialized training. She had pushed her body to limits she hadn't known existed, developed mental resilience that allowed her to function under extreme stress, and proven her leadership capabilities in scenarios that challenged experienced professionals. But, more than that, she had discovered something about herself that she hadn't known before. She thrived in environments that demanded excellence, and she was willing to pay whatever price was necessary to find out what she was truly capable of achieving. Looking across the desk at Commander Taylor, the person who had become her mentor, her toughest critic, and her strongest advocate, Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She was ready to leave behind the safety of conventional military service and pursue something that might destroy her but could also transform her into someone capable of accomplishing things that most people could only dream about. The girl from Sweetwater, Texas, who had thrown a punch in defense of her dignity, was about to begin a journey that would test everything she thought she knew about courage, determination, and what it truly meant to serve something greater than herself. Sarah's commitment to pursuing SEAL training was absolute, but nothing could have prepared her for what the next 2 years would demand of her. The preliminary screening program alone was more challenging than anything she had imagined possible. Conducted at a classified location in California, the program pushed candidates through increasingly difficult physical, mental, and leadership challenges designed to identify those who had the potential to survive the even more demanding training that followed. The first week of screening eliminated nearly half of the candidates. Sarah watched people who had seemed invincible during basic training simply give up when faced with the relentless physical demands and psychological pressure. Swimming exercises that lasted for hours in cold Pacific water, obstacle courses that required problem-solving while exhausted, and leadership scenarios where failure meant starting over from the beginning created an environment where only those with extraordinary determination could survive. But Sarah not only survived, she excelled. The years of preparation with Commander Taylor had given her advantages that became apparent immediately. While other candidates struggled with the swimming requirements, Sarah's conditioning allowed her to maintain performance even when hypothermia was setting in. When leadership exercises placed her in charge of teams facing impossible deadlines and insufficient resources, her experience with complex decision-making under stress enabled her to find solutions that others missed. Most importantly, Sarah had developed the mental resilience that separated those who completed challenging training from those who quit when things became difficult. She had learned to compartmentalize physical discomfort, to continue thinking clearly when her body was screaming for rest, and to maintain focus on mission objectives even when everything around her was chaotic. The instructors at the screening program took notice of Sarah's performance immediately. Her combination of physical capabilities, mental toughness, and natural leadership made her stand out among candidates who were already exceptional by any normal standard. But they also recognized that her success would depend on more than individual performance. She would need to earn the respect and acceptance of teammates who might initially view her presence with skepticism. This challenge became apparent during the team-building phase of screening, where candidates were organized into small units and given complex missions that required complete cooperation to accomplish successfully. Sarah found herself working with people from diverse military backgrounds, including Marines, Army Rangers, and Air Force Special Operations personnel. Some of these individuals had already formed opinions about women in combat roles, and those opinions weren't always supportive. One particular mission involved a simulated hostage rescue that required the team to infiltrate a defended compound, neutralize threats, and extract personnel without causing civilian casualties. Sarah was assigned as the team leader for this exercise, a decision that created immediate tension among some team members who questioned whether she had the experience and capability to guide them through such a complex scenario. The initial planning session revealed the extent of the challenge Sarah faced. Several team members openly questioned her tactical decisions, suggesting alternatives that they claimed were based on real-world experience rather than theoretical knowledge. The atmosphere in the room was tense, with Sarah needing to establish her authority without alienating people whose cooperation would be essential for mission success. Sarah's approach drew directly from the lessons Commander Taylor had taught her about leadership under pressure. Instead of asserting authority based on rank or assignment, she focused on demonstrating competence through the quality of her planning and decision-making. She listened carefully to every suggestion, evaluated alternatives objectively, and incorporated the best ideas regardless of their source. When team members challenged her decisions, she explained her reasoning clearly and invited feedback that could improve the plan. The mission itself was a complete success. Sarah's planning proved to be thorough and adaptable, her leadership during execution kept the team coordinated under stress, and her tactical decisions led to the successful completion of all objectives without casualties. More importantly, her performance during the mission earned the respect of team members who had initially doubted her capabilities. After the exercise, one of the Marine veterans who had been most skeptical about working under Sarah's leadership pulled her aside for a private conversation. "I've worked with a lot of people over the years," he said, "and I've learned that competence is what matters in the field. You've got that competence, and you've got something else that's even more important: you make the people around you better at their jobs. That's what real leadership looks like." This pattern repeated throughout the screening program. Sarah consistently demonstrated that her presence on a team improved overall performance rather than creating problems or distractions. Her technical skills were excellent, but her ability to bring out the best in other people proved to be equally valuable. By the time screening concluded, she had earned the respect of instructors and fellow candidates alike. When the final screening results were announced, Sarah was among the small percentage of candidates selected to proceed to BUD/S training. But her success came with recognition that the real test was just beginning. Basic underwater demolition/SEAL training was legendary for its difficulty, designed to push candidates beyond what they believed they could endure while teaching the technical skills necessary for special operations missions. BUD/S training took place at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, California, and, from the moment Sarah arrived, she understood that everything she had experienced so far had been preparation for this ultimate challenge. The physical standards were higher than anything she had previously encountered, the technical training was incredibly complex, and the psychological pressure was designed to break down anyone who didn't have absolute commitment to completing the program. The first phase of training focused on physical conditioning and basic seamanship skills, but at levels that challenged even the most prepared candidates. Swimming distances that had seemed impossible when she first began training with Commander Taylor were now daily requirements. Running times that would qualify for Olympic competition were considered minimum standards. Obstacle courses that required technical skill as well as physical capability had to be completed while carrying equipment that weighed nearly as much as Sarah herself. But the physical challenges were only part of the equation. Sarah also had to master technical skills that ranged from advanced small boat operations to complex communications procedures. She learned to operate in small teams under conditions that simulated real combat scenarios, where mistakes could have life or death consequences. Every exercise was designed to test not just individual capabilities but the ability to function as part of a unit where everyone's survival depended on everyone else's performance. The famous Hell Week of BUD/S training proved to be everything Sarah had heard and more. 5.5 days of continuous training with no more than 4 hours of total sleep tested every aspect of her preparation. Physical exhaustion reached levels that made rational thinking nearly impossible, but the training continued relentlessly. Candidates who had seemed unbreakable during earlier phases suddenly discovered their limits and chose to quit rather than continue. Sarah later described Hell Week as the point where she truly understood what Commander Taylor had been preparing her for during those early morning training sessions. The physical conditioning was essential, but the mental resilience that allowed her to continue functioning when her body was shutting down was what made the difference between completion and failure. She drew on lessons learned during every challenging moment of her preparation, remembering that her goal wasn't just to survive but to excel under conditions that broke most people. When Hell Week concluded, fewer than 30% of the original class remained. Sarah was not only among the survivors but had consistently performed at the top of her class throughout the ordeal. Her instructors noted that she had never appeared close to quitting, maintaining focus and performance even during the most demanding phases of the training. The remaining phases of BUD/S training focused on advanced combat skills, diving operations, and land warfare tactics. Sarah mastered each area systematically, bringing the same determination and attention to detail that had characterized her performance throughout the program. She became proficient with weapons systems that most military personnel never had access to, learned diving techniques that allowed operations in conditions where most people couldn't survive, and developed small unit tactics that prepared her for missions behind enemy lines. But, perhaps most importantly, Sarah discovered that her success wasn't just individual achievement, it was opening doors for other women who wanted to serve in special operations roles. Her performance demonstrated that gender was irrelevant when it came to meeting the standards required for elite military units. The combination of physical capability, mental toughness, and leadership skills that made someone successful in SEAL training existed independent of any demographic characteristics. When Sarah graduated from BUD/S training, she had accomplished something that less than 5% of candidates achieved. But, more than that, she had proven to herself and others that with proper preparation, absolute commitment, and the right mentorship, it was possible to exceed even the most ambitious goals. The girl from Sweetwater, Texas, who had thrown a punch in defense of her dignity had become one of the most elite warriors in the world. Commander Taylor attended Sarah's graduation ceremony, and their conversation afterward captured the remarkable journey that had brought them both to this moment. "You've exceeded every expectation I had when we first met," Taylor told her. "But I want you to remember that this graduation isn't an ending, it's the beginning of a career where you'll face challenges that will make everything you've done so far look like preparation exercises." Sarah looked around at the graduation ceremony, seeing families celebrating their loved ones' achievements and fellow graduates preparing for assignments that would take them to the most challenging environments in the world. She thought about the path that had brought her to this point, from a small town in Texas where dreams seemed limited to this moment where anything seemed possible. "I understand, sir," Sarah replied. "And I'm ready for whatever comes next." The punch that had started everything had lasted less than a second. The transformation it initiated would continue for the rest of her life, as Sarah Martinez went on to serve in special operations units around the world, eventually becoming a mentor herself for the next generation of warriors who would discover that the most significant barriers to achievement are often the ones we create in our own minds. Years later, when Sarah was asked to describe the most important moment in her military career, she always returned to that first conversation with Commander Taylor after the incident in the gymnasium. Not because of what she had accomplished, but because of what she had learned about the power of seeing potential in people who might not see it in themselves, and the responsibility that comes with helping others discover what they're truly capable of achieving.